Hi, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar here today. I wanted to take a minute and just welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. My name is Vidya Ananthakrishnan, and I co-direct the Columbia Justice Lab's Youth Justice Initiatives team. Our youth justice portfolio aims to create a world where all youth, especially youth of color and those who have long been marginalized, have the opportunities and supports they need to grow, flourish, and thrive in their own homes and communities outside of the legal system. Today, we're kicking off a series of discussions called Taking on Transformation, which will outline a vision of transforming youth justice in this country. For our youth justice portfolio, this vision of transformation includes a focus on four key things: closing youth prisons, directing funds away from incarceration, investing resources in the communities most impacted by incarceration, and centering those who are most impacted in designing and leading efforts to create safety. We know how critical and urgent this work is right now, particularly as the country reckons with its longstanding history of oppression and racism, and how that manifests itself in our legal systems. We also know that transformation is a process that takes commitment and an intentional focus on values that guide where we're headed. For us, this means being laser focused on equity and racial justice, keeping youth, families, and communities at the forefront of everything that we're doing, and taking bold steps toward building a future without reliance on youth prisons. Today's webinar will help set the stage for transformation in this values-driven way. Our terrific panelists, who you'll meet shortly, will share more about what we need in the moment, what we can learn from the past, and how to move forward toward that community-centered future. This conversation is also co-hosted by the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, a membership group of current and former administrators of youth justice agencies. These individuals have been at the highest positions in the very government systems that are charged with incarcerating young people, and are now calling for an end to the use of the punitive youth prison model and harmful systems of punishment that surround them. In future conversations, we'll involve other perspectives and dig deeper into the specifics of who needs to be at the table and how to plan for transformation, as well as the nuts and bolts of implementation. Before we dive into today's topic, we did just want to thank the Stoneleaf Foundation for its generous support of our work. I also want to remind everyone that even though this will remain a closed panel, we will aim to reserve time at the end for the panelists to answer questions. Feel free to use the Q&A feature in your webinar control panel to submit questions at any time throughout the discussion. Lastly, we plan to share a recording of this discussion after the event, along with more information on future conversations and other materials. With that, I want to turn it over to our amazing group of panelists. I'll start by introducing our moderator, Jarrell Daniels, who brings his own expert knowledge to this conversation. Jarrell is a 2021 Truman Scholar and a senior at Columbia University School of General Studies. He's the founder and program manager of the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council program at Columbia University's Center for Justice. JAYC brings New York City youth together with city officials to discuss community challenges and to co-author policy proposals that seek to reform systems and institutions. Since his release from prison, Jarrell has become a sought-after speaker, which led him to giving a TED Talk highlighting the factors that led to his incarceration while introducing to collaborative education for community members and public officials. He's working on changing the narrative of the criminal justice system to ensure that justice and democracy is applied equally to all. Jarrell aspires to become a United States Senator and to help propose legislation around eliminating the 13th Amendment and the exception clause. We're really thrilled to have him here today. So I want to extend a warm welcome to him and turn it over. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Vidya, for that wonderful introduction. And really welcome everyone who's on listening in today. And really today is less about me and more about the esteemed panelists who I'm going to introduce in a few. But just to add more context to my life story and how I got where I am today, everything that you see, that you've heard around what I'm doing now came into fruition after I participated in a program called Inside Criminal Justice, which was a program administered by the Center for Justice at Columbia University. Prosecutors from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office inside of Queensborough Correctional Facility to work with the incarcerated population. And I was in part of the inaugural cohort where we sat with ADAs and came up with jointly authored policy recommendations after spending a semester-long period together. So really, this was the first time in perhaps U.S. history where prosecutors worked with an incarcerated population to allow them to inform recommendations to improve some of the prosecutorial practices. It was perhaps the most phenomenal experience I had in my life. But I left the program with one question: why are we waiting for people to hold the mark of a felony conviction before we give them the type of leadership opportunity to be a part of policy change and institutional reform? And that's really what led to the creation and development of the Justice Ambassadors. Really, I mirrored all of the principles and core structure of inside criminal justice and applied it to the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council. And that's really an opportunity for 18 to 25-year-olds to collaborate with local government officials here in New York City to call for policy recommendations. But again, as I said, today is less about me and more about our esteemed panelists, and really given a theme of taking on transformation within the criminal justice system. I think it's most important that we hear from our panelists. And I want to end by really saying that I'm a novice in this field of criminal justice reform, and I'm really eager to learn from our esteemed panelists as much as you perhaps all are as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you first to Gladys Carrion, who is what I will refer to as a Bronx Knight. She was born and raised in the Bronx, New York. Gladys is currently the co-chair of the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice and a senior fellow at the Columbia Justice Lab. She is also a former commissioner of the Administration of Child Services and the Department of Youth and Community Development. Welcome, Gladys, and we're happy to have you here today. Next up, we have Missy Farouk, and she's the National Field Director for the Youth First Initiative. Missy supports state-based campaigns by providing technical assistance, training, and strategic support. Previously, she worked as a juvenile justice policy strategist for the National ACLU and a campaign director for the Washington State ACLU. Welcome, Missy, and we're excited to have you as well. And finally, last but not least, we have Clinton Lacey, who is the president and CEO of the Credible Messengers Mentoring Movement, CM3, which focuses on supporting credible messengers, mentors, who share similar experiences to the current justice-involved young people and are poised to have the transformative impact on an individual, family, community, and systemic level. Previously, Clinton served as the director of the District of Columbia Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services and deputy commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation. I want you all to help me welcome our esteemed panelists. Welcome. Just to really open up the conversation, I want to begin by asking Clinton, we're talking about shifting decision-making and resources from government-ran youth justice systems to communities and community-led supports. What role do current and future government system leaders need to have?
Thank you so much for that question, and it's an honor to be here with the distinguished panelists, colleagues, and distinguished audience, of course, everyone engaged in this work. I think it's such a powerful question and worth just sort of thinking about momentarily as I answer the question you raised. We're talking about shifting, if I could paraphrase a bit, shifting reliance on systems, traditional systems, the traditional justice system, and shifting that emphasis and reliance in significant ways to community. And that's a mouthful, like that's a huge idea actually, because it's one that implies and ultimately requires, if successful and if substantive and if real and authentic, the system really giving up something, right? Giving up its traditional predominant power, authority, and resources, right? So that becomes a frightening thing. It becomes a challenging thing, but I think it is a big idea and an idea that's overdue. And so, you know, to begin to answer it then, I think we first got to confront what we're actually talking about. We're not talking about tinkering at the edges. We're not talking about maintaining the status quo while perhaps improving it a bit, but we're talking about a real shift in the way that justice itself is practiced, and that communities and that people and families and young folks in particular are seen, viewed, and involved in this process. So I like to think of it and answer the question sort of in the context of the way I try to apply somewhat of a historical lens to it. You know, I tend to think about the major sort of eras of justice work and justice, practice and reforms, particularly so-called juvenile justice, thinking about the initial foundations of that in this country, which certainly were born in colonialism and racism and a bunch of isms and issues that have had horrible impacts on youth of color, on families of color, on young people and communities in general. And so we know that that era was very punitive, that it had low expectations for youth of color, that it had disparate treatment, that it had unfair, under-resourced approaches for young people of color, and was just generally very harmful. And of course, throughout time, there's been resistance and reform. We could go throughout history, for the founding of family court and the whole movement back then to try to improve the treatment of young people, and throughout time. And I think over time, and particularly over the last 30 years, there's been a very robust reform movement, an effort to really look at the rights of children, right? The processes by which they are treated, trying to understand the environmental impacts that contribute to what happens to young people, the conditions in our system, the conditions of confinement in detention centers, developing alternatives, and various things that I think have been, very important, very hard-won struggles and steps taken to improve the system. But yet I think it's no surprise that we still at this point are largely grappling with yet unresolved issues that go back to the foundation, right? Issues of racial disparities, issues of a failure to really change a process that leaves communities highly marginalized and justice-involved young people woefully underserved. And I think the reason why we're still struggling with that is that there have been limits to the vision, right, and the aspiration of the reforms that have been taking place. They've been important. They have made a difference in young people's lives. But I think it's been particularly system self-centered. I think it's been led by system folks largely with not nearly enough community voice, community perspective, community presence at the reform table, right? And this has been a struggle, and there have been leaders who have tried to improve that. But I think the overall, sort of analysis of the reform era, if we could call it that, I think ultimately it's fair to say that community voice and presence and participation and community power in this process has been, woefully lacking. And so that if we're going to break through to another era, which I like to call the transformative era, that really is defined by this fundamental shift that you speak about in your question, right? If we're really going to shift reliance from systems to communities, then our work has to go beyond trying to make a better system, a kinder system, right? More humane treatment, a smarter system, evidence-based practices, curriculum, training, and these things, fine, good things, many of them, not all, right? But moving beyond that to make a better, smarter, kinder system to a totally radically different conception of what justice looks like. And that means not just a better probation department, right? Or a better juvenile justice system or a better DYRS, but something different that says that our greatest value as government justice agencies isn't in our ability to do good programs and to train good staff. While those things are important, our greater value is as facilitators and investors and supporters of a process that puts community credible messengers, parents, community-based organizations, alternative programs in the place, in the room, at the table.
Clinton, I wanted to interject. Clinton, I can agree with you, and I wanted to ask you, what kind of leader? I mean, you and I have led systems, and so what's the difference now as we're saying that we want to shift to the community, and that this is about shifting power, and this is really transformative change that will look different because we're not fixing the box, right? We're not fixing the box anymore. So what kind of leader, and as we give advice to current leaders, right, and advocates, what is it, that we need to make sure that folks that are leading these systems bring? And, for me, they have to be a coalition builder, right? They have to build support. They have to work in community. They have to center young people. But those are hard things, to be able to do, right? To be able to have the skill set to build community, to have a diverse set of tables, right? Where you don't get to set the table necessarily now, right? You have to go to different tables, and be cognizant of that. And so how does that look now as we tell folks the way we do this? Because certainly when I reflect, and I'm sure the same thing, when I was leading change in New York, I would probably do things different now because I've learned more, right? I've learned more, I've seen, and I think that while change in New York was effective, certainly, and Mishi was a partner there with me, we now know a lot more and what works better and how to really engage with young people and with families in a more authentic way where their voice is really heard, that it's not just come to a meeting, right?
Right. I think that, that is the question. And I think what, in terms of what kind of leaders do we need? So we need leaders with a new and evolved mentality and identity of what their role and purpose is, right? Our role and our purpose as system leaders has to expand and shift to not just improving the box, right? Or gradually trying to add pieces to the box, but to break down the wall, right? Or perhaps more easily put, open the door to be the bridge builders that you talk about. It means sharing space, right? Yep. It means sharing resources. It means giving community voice and participants a place at the table. So a leader has to have that mentality and identity as what is my role, what is my purpose, what is my greatest value? And therefore, how do I strategically, because you gotta be shrewd, strategic, you gotta pick your battles, and all those things are important, right? Considering politics and resources, of course. But I think the overarching vision is the question. Leaders with a vision for transformation, right? Yeah. That we start there, that we don't start with, hey, what's the latest program? What's the latest evidence-based practice? That conversation is important, but we start with what is the greater vision? So we need visionary leaders who are willing
and
to-
values, right? And values, vision and values.
Yeah. Guided by values that are willing to use that limited time and opportunity, right, that we end up having to try to push things forward in a shrewd way that obviously doesn't derail your whole effort, but that moves the ball forward towards that North Star, though. So that's why I think the visionary North Star is key when we're talking about what a leader needs to have.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in because I am so excited to be on this panel with Gladys and Clinton. They're two people who I consider like my personal professional heroes. And so, I feel like thinking about your leadership, both of the leadership that you both have embraced over the last, I maybe we shouldn't age ourselves, but we worked together for a long time, is I think that one of the things that's really about both of your leadership and other system leaders who have embraced transformational change is that you're willing to be disruptors. And I think that's so critical, is to be willing to be disruptive, because there's so much cognitive dissonance that takes place when you are part of the youth justice system. You sort of embrace the many sort of contradictions that we see all the time in the youth justice system, right? That, we're putting young people in prisons, we're incarcerating them for public safety, even though all the research shows that incarceration actually increases crime. That, you'll see system leaders saying that, young people of color are incarcerated at disproportionately, wildly disproportionate rates because those are the young people who are committing the most crimes, and we know that's not true. Or they'll say that yes, it's a structural issue, but I don't have any control over the young people who are sent to me. Or you'll see system leaders say things like it's that we need to like, we can provide trauma-informed care inside facilities when you can't provide trauma-informed care inside facilities that look and feel like adult prisons. And I think what's so important about like system leaders that are willing to be disruptive is to really call those contradictions on their face. And I know that both of you have done that. And so I think I'm really excited about this conversation around how do system leaders be willing to like not only be disruptors, and like as you said, Gladys, be coalition builders, and how to like but ultimately be willing to cede power to community. And so one of the things I see as our role at Youth First is we partner with groups around the country that are doing campaigns to close youth prisons, invest in community alternatives. And what we try to do is try to get particularly the adults who work in this space to see their roles not as advocates, but as organizers, right? So advocates are people who speak on behalf of other people. They might have the best interests of young people at heart, and they are speaking on what they think is the best interest of young people. But organizing really is about changing power relationships and shifting power, and as you said, Clinton. And so I think it's really important not only for people who are working on the outside to be organizers and really thinking about like true leadership development of people who are most impacted, and how are they making sure that young people really have the skills and support that they need to be leaders in this movement, but also for system leaders to see themselves as organizers, right? To see themselves as their role of changing power relationships and not being advocates, thinking, oh, I know what's in the best interest of young people. What I'm doing is in the best interest of the young people, but really like, how do I, in my role, place young people in the center of coming up with what their vision is, and how do we help young people and their communities realize that vision? And so I think, ultimately, like you both are like these incredible disruptors. And I think that's what leadership really need, at least for true system transformation, that's what we need to start with.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Mishi. And I was actually, I started smiling at the end because I was waiting to just add more and really underscore that last point that you made. Is really centering young people at the part of this institutional reform that we're taking on. And I think like you look of a lot of the youth-centered approaches, it often is disconnected from young people itself. Young people aren't given the leadership opportunity to be a part of policy advocacy, part of it, to be a part of the working group circles, to be a part of all of the system reform that's happening that's intent and aimed at improving the quality of life for young people. But young people don't really have a stake in even shaping those newfound initiatives, those newfound programs and services. So just want to really underscore that as really the value that we have to carry forward in this work. And I'm relatively, not up there in age as of yet, but I'm kind of close in age with the young people who I work with. And I know that what I've tried to be intentional about is not speaking on their behalf, but really empowering them to really be the advocate of challenges that they're facing right now. Although I may have overcame those challenges, it's just that I'm no longer facing it, and it's most appropriate for the person who's living with that right now to carry that forward. So I just want to turn it back to the panelists and ask an additional question. What are the values that we should have embedded in this work in transforming these correctional systems?
I really think that we need to center young people at the core of this work. You have to be constantly asking, when you're in these positions and making decisions, is this in the interest of the young people? And you have to bring those voices in. You have to listen to young people, because I think we make, this is for me, transformation adult behavior. It's about the adults and really changing their behavior, their minds, their approach to young people. And it's really important to have that voice constantly. And, you have to recognize, right? I mean, for me, you have to recognize the harm the system has done and continues to do to young people. And you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to speak about that, because people need to understand that these systems cause harm. And you have to be cognizant of the fact that who we incarcerate in this country are Black and brown young people, almost exclusively. And that has to drive and inform your work. And you have to see, you have tremendous it's not unlimited, but you certainly have tremendous power and resources as a system leader, and information and resources, and opening that up. You really have to value the input, the knowledge that's housed in communities that really have solutions. And you have to honor that, and you have to respect that, and you have to value that, and you have to find ways to really share the information that you have, right, to help inform. In New York, when I became the commissioner, those facilities were closed. No one was allowed to go into any of those facilities. And transparency is really important, opening up those facilities, right? Letting people come in from the community to see what is happening, to be vocal about what resources you have, what services you have, and what you don't have. And this expectation that these systems, and I'll talk about mine, was helping, was helping young people. We were teaching young people how to behave within a carceral setting. And so it's real, you have to acknowledge that. And you need to be a champion and a voice out there for the transformation. And you have to allow you have to seed, not even allow, you have to seed power, that there are other voices there that have the to participate, to lead, to initiate the change, and you have to listen. And that's a really important, I think, characteristic and value, that you respect and honor the opinions of others, their knowledge and their experience that is as important as yours and other people in the system. And that this is a collective, right? That not one person owns this transformation, that it is a shared responsibility, and that you have to understand that. And I think that's really important. And I think that, Clinton has done that in working in his work of bringing in the people that really know how to do the work, and being able to share the information you have, the knowledge you have, and be humble about the fact that other people might know more than you know.
Yeah, Gladys, I wanted to, even and ask you a question sort of connected to the previous one, but this one, and you had brought up values in the beginning of this conversation as we were talking, right? And at first I would just say, when I hear the word value, I sort of try to sum up, I suppose, to capture so many important values in the word love. And of course, we began, well, we weren't the first, but we began using out explicitly the L word, right? Love, and saying that we were going to base our work at CYRS on the principle of love, like in the tradition of Martin Luther King saying that true justice is an act of love in public, right? So, and work that's been done around, or writing and thought around love and public policy. So our mantra was, what does love look like? How does it translate beyond words and sentiment to the to activating values, right? To how does love translate into policy practice, into the experience of the young people ultimately that we always talk about, and part of doing that and trying to infuse love and put it into practice and systems that weren't built in that way, and in political waters that don't necessarily get or support that. I wanted to ask you and Mishi, how have you been so successful as a disruptor, as an innovator, as one infusing love in such difficult waters? I feel that in DC, I had some political and resource space that isn't necessary, that was unique and not common in many jurisdictions. How do you do that in New York and in other places around the country?
I think Michi will agree. I mean, New York is a really resource-rich place. I mean, so that, and we had lots of stars aligned. But I got to tell you, that maybe, I admire your ability to use the word love. I think the way I used it, right, was really a mantra, which is, these are our children, all of our children. And we are responsible, right? We have a responsibility. And every place I went, I mean, I just reminded everyone that these are our children because I wanted to bring it home. How do you, right? Like, what do you do for your children? What are your expectations? What are the supports? What are the services? Would you treat your child this way, right? I would remind them all the time. You really are going to put your child, 24/7 in a box, in a cell? Is this what you would do? Would you confine your child to their room, without a television and a radio and a cot, right? Is that what you would do to your child? And invariably the answer was no. So I said, well, then you can't do it to anybody else's child, right? And I really worked hard to instill a sense of responsibility of the folks that I had to convince. I didn't have to convince the community, but other system leaders and folks that I had to interact, that I had to leverage resources and support and engage them so that they would join in advocating for change, right? And would be there. That's how and quite frankly, the other, and I'm sure you use this too, we all ran incredibly expensive systems, right? A waste of total money of taxpayer dollar, right? And reminding people that this money, what's the alternative use? What should be the default really for using this money? Investing in under-resourced communities, right? In better schools and recreation and music and support, and really investing in communities, impacted communities, investing in young people, reminding them of how wasteful we are and what poor outcomes we were getting, right? But always bringing it back to what do you provide for your child? Because we have to wrap ourselves, right, around these young people. What are their needs? And listen. And invariably, people would listen, right? People would listen and really it would resonate. So it was very much like, you have to love, right? You have to care. You have to care about young people. And that's, tell me about a trait for a system leader. You got to care, right? You got to care. And that has to really drive what you do, is you got to care about these young people. And you and I'm sure, Mishi, see ourselves reflected in these young people and see ourselves, from coming from very same communities. Certainly, as people of color, we have very high expectations of what we want to do and expectations from community about what we should do. Given who we are, and we have to acknowledge that. And sometimes we disappoint people, but I certainly felt that in taking these jobs, certainly didn't do it for fame, right? Didn't do it for the money. I did it because I cared. This was my community, and not many people that come from our backgrounds have the opportunity to have these jobs. So how do you maximize and leverage that momentary power that you're going to have for a very finite period of time? How do you translate that into transformative change that will impact the lives? And how do you do that in the context of the people that are most impacted, right? Whose voice really matters. And so those are some of the things that we did in New York to create an environment and the conditions for change. And Mishi, I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things also when I think about the transformation that's happened in DC and also in New York, and for true system transformation to happen is, the system leaders really have to let go a lot of their biases and their judgment that they have about young people and about their families and communities. I think a lot of times, there's a tendency to see the young person as the problem, or to see either their young person or their family or their community as the problem, rather to recognize that, young people and their families and communities have so many strengths, and that what really systems should be doing is really how to, build on those strengths, rather than like always working from this deficit-based model. We have to somehow fix these young people or fix their communities or fix their families. And so I think one of the things that's really amazing, like to see some of this system transformation happening is like, like now in New York and DC, we have Credible Messenger mentoring, which really is about, building on the strengths of communities. Folks from those same communities are mentoring young people who've, like so that the young people are, these are like their natural, these are folks that they can, naturally relate to because they're from the same communities, they've navigated the same circumstances. So it's like, really looking to the people who are who've always been there in the community, but like system leaders have never really seen as natural partners. And so I think that's one of the major things that, I've seen happen in New York and DC is like this recognition that we actually, all of the solutions are already there, they're in community, and we just need to like give community the space to be able to support their young people, to support their families, and that space hasn't been there before. And so I think that's one of the major changes, sort of shifts in thinking that we've seen.
Yeah, I think if I could just add anything more to all of the lovely remarks that I've just heard is really just to underscore the emphasis on a human-centered approach. Like these are human beings coming before you. But I also want to highlight the fact that we're talking about changing the culture of institutions and systems. And the best way for us to really engage in that is to do it in a meaningful way. So what that means is actually employing the young people, employing the people with the Credible Messenger experience within these systems so that they can be a part of the institutional change. Invite them to the meetings and don't just have them there as an advisory group. Let them be a part of actually driving a change in a meaningful way. And what I want to really say to emphasize this is we're going to have moments where we do something progressive. And I'll give you an actual example. You have a young person who commits an act of whatever it may be, and you give that young person an alternative to incarceration. Then that young person goes out and commits another maybe violent or serious offense. And then system leaders or system actors will use this one-off moment, this rare phenomenon, and say, this is why we can't do these progressive types of reform. This is why we shouldn't have raised the age and the bail reforms that exist in New York City. Well, we can't fall into this mindset of this one-off type of anomaly happening and allowing that to deter our moment of progression within the agency. So I just wanted to leave that there for the audience to really take away is, if anything, don't allow your progressive and liberal-minded thinking to be thwarted by an incident like that, because that will happen, but that's not necessarily a reflection of the larger group of people who may benefit from having an alternative approach from justice, contact, and involvement. But just another question I really wanted to ask you was, what could the system look like with support from community partners in this transformation?
I certainly think it looks smaller. I think that the huge amount of resources that have been pumped into systems for generations without very much accountability. We all know and have talked about how unique systems like the justice system are to other situations where the report card hasn't been good, but they continue to get funded because there's this, a set of beliefs about social control, about controlling the people in communities and those who are in these systems. And so the successes have not been great in terms of outcomes, in terms of recidivism and what have you. Yet there continues to be like this habitual, reliance on what many of us agree have been a failed system. So reform efforts have been in place, as we talked about before. But I think a healthy process looks like a smaller system with much greater resources and investment for community activity, credible messengers, parents, families, community-based organizations, which serve not just as alternatives to detention, but throughout the whole continuum, right? An alternative way of thinking about how we're responding to our young people, and then addressing some of the root dynamics behind that are contributing to our young people coming to the system. I think it looks like, Mishi had mentioned it before, and Gladys talked about it and has done it. It looks like power share, right? And like and that comes down to one of the more sort of difficult conversations, right, or processes, but it's one that we really got to confront. I mean, I think that there's a lot of important work being done. We've done a lot of important work that I think demonstrated the power and effect and impact of community. But it remains sort of from outside referrals. We'll refer our kids to these programs. We'll fund programs to provide services, which is great. But I think we have to continue to move from what I refer to as sort of the system dating the community, you know, and in a sort of, you know, token way at times, and sometimes more meaningfully, to what I refer to in our DC experiment as an arranged marriage. Like, we moved credible messengers and parents in with us. So they were at the table, at decision-making tables. Now that's hard, that's difficult. It required role clarification, team building, you know, biases on both sides, from the system employees and managers to community folks, right? But we felt it was the only way to change the culture was to get in the room, to get at the table and really try to work out how can we move things forward. So I think a system looks like real voice and power, and that's hard, right? So you got to break that down. What does that actually look like? Well, what does assessment look like when young people coming in the door, and who leads that and who informs that? Case planning, community supervision, programming inside of detention centers. Who defines that, right? Who leads that? Who facilitates that? And I think that what we've been fighting for is to get more community, parents, credible messengers, and others to actually be in those roles, both as through hiring folks into agencies as a part of it, but also by just investing in and opening up space for community to occupy those responsibilities without necessarily joining the government.
Yeah, and just, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Gladys.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that what the system would look like if it really, as Gladys's point, like, you know, if the system leaders created a system where it was for their own children, we would not have any youth prisons in this country. Like, no system leader would be like, the right place for my kid to go is to be locked up in a youth prison. And so, so I think that vision, ultimately, the vision that we all need to have is you know, a world with no youth prisons. Like that, there's no circumstance where incarcerating a child would actually benefit public safety or benefit that young person. And so ultimately, like, I agree with Clinton like completely that we need to shrink the system, but it needs to be whatever shrinking needs to happen. Like, we need to completely eliminate all youth prisons and jails in this country. And so, like, that vision has to be a part of, you know, what we all are sort of working towards in the long run. And Gladys, I want to pass it to you.
Yeah, you know, I was going to say, and I agree, youth prison shouldn't be the default, and it's the default now. And so that we need to really create the conditions in communities where communities can support their young people, where we have good schools, we have good housing. We're looking at the recourses. Where's the pipeline? Why is our response incarcerating young people rather than dealing and meeting the needs in community? And I, you know, all that money that we invest in incarceration and creating carceral systems should be really in communities and creating the resources and supports that young people need. And I always say this, and I'm not being facetious, and I'm not being, you know, we figured out what we should be doing with young people who get into trouble. Those young people happen to be white. We figured out how to deal with whatever issues they present, whatever challenges they have. We have dealt with that as a country, and the response has not been mass incarceration of white children. So it just seems to me that we need to find out what is it that they're doing. And it's easy. Look at their communities. Look at the segregation in this country. Look at the education system in this country, in the 7 zip codes that populate, you know, the juvenile justice system in New York City. And you have an, you know, it'll answer. You have an answer there. You can compare that. And so we need to stop thinking of responses as what's the response to justice involved youth. So it's what's the response to young people? What's appropriate as a society that we provide for young people? And we create that system. And, people say, well, what about young people that commit very serious harm? And I think that's a conversation we need to have. We haven't figured that out. And I don't think we're ready yet to say they should go into the community. We have to create those supports and response to young people that commit serious crime. And I envision, like Mishi and like Clinton, a time where we don't incarcerate our young people. It's a process, and we need to figure out what we do. And I think that that's a conversation that we all need to have with community of how do we respond to that. But those numbers are very low numbers, right? Of young people who really commit very, very serious harm, that are harm to themselves or their community. And we have to acknowledge that and call that and grapple that. But I think for the vast majority of young people, certainly in New York, didn't have to be, and don't. We still are incarcerating more, confining more young people than necessary in New York, even when our numbers are so low. And so I envision a community and a response like the one I provided for my children, the one that Clinton is providing, the one that Mishi is providing, and that we have those resources available for everybody. And it's about the well-being of young people, and how do we invest in the well-being of young people and the well-being of communities that are thriving, that are doing well and exceeding, just like we want for any other young person, and where we want to live, and where we want to nurture and raise our children. That's what we should want, and that's the system we should have. The system shouldn't be prison.
I agree with you, and I think that we all got our work cut out for us. One of the things I do want to highlight here is that this work doesn't operate between a 9 to 5, Monday through Friday type of schedule. So if this is something that you're truly committed to, then you will be working outside of those boundaries. If this is truly what you care about and are passionate about being a part of change. But I do want to start asking some of the questions from the audience here, and I want to start with Sue Mangold's question. She asked, following up on Clinton's remarks, can the existing system be reformed in the ways you are calling for, so that the smaller vision of the current system with reforms can work? I'm going to read that first part of the question again. Can the existing system be reformed in the ways that we're calling for, so that a smaller version of the current system with reforms can work? Or do we have to ultimately shape a vision of abolition and do an entirely new reimagination? That's a big one.
I think, I would agree with with Gladys and Mishi around, a vision for abolishing. First of all, we don't need to put children in cages. We don't need to have them sleeping in beds with the toilet next to their head. We don't need to be putting them in shackles. We don't need to be using pepper spray. We don't need large institutions with bars and barbed wire, not even for the most quote unquote dangerous, most troubled young people who are very small in number. And so there are ways, and I connect that conversation. So I think we can achieve it, but it really calls into question some fundamental beliefs. First of all, about our young people, when Gladys mentioned about the system we have that by and large works one way for white and affluent young people, which has a core set of assumptions and beliefs, right? That they are worthy of it, that we have to do everything possible to keep them out of those places, right? Those jails, that they have a future that we must protect, right? That
they're capable of changing, right? That young people make mistakes. We got to give them a chance, right?
Right, all of that.
Got to wrap family and services supports around them.
Exactly, and that's what happens, and they receive rallying around them for that, right? And so, and this is an issue. This is a conversation that we have. We had it at GYRS. We've had it in places with Black leadership, with folks of color working in systems, because these beliefs are rooted inside of folks of all color that we have to break out of and to begin to see our young people as worthy. But I also think, and we were having a conversation with regards to the viability of ever getting systems to reach this, is Mishi said that system leaders need to be organizers. And, and so as community organizers, we have to mobilize people. I mean, there's the political reality. To what extent are system leaders and elected officials held accountable to ensure that they are pursuing these goals that we're talking about. So educating the community, organizing and mobilizing around this to support these efforts is critical, so that leaders who with this vision are supported, that they can survive, that they aren't run out or marginalized because they're trying to move in this direction. And that takes community support, it takes political support. And I do think that that's a part of the conversation that we also have to talk about.
You know, and I want to stress, and I agree, I want to stress that change has happened and we've acknowledged that. And in some places they're far ahead. In some places, you know, have really worked hard to try to figure out how to authentically engage community and impacted young people into the work. And it's a work in progress. So I don't want anyone to think that this is not possible, right? It's a journey. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen as fast as we would like it to happen. Like for me, I always think, I looked at my work, what's the life of a young person? And when, we'd say it takes 6 months to say 6 months is a long time in the life of a young person. Imagine 3-5 years, right? I'd always try to quantify it that way. But change has happened. More needs to be done. I think we need to dismantle the box that we have and think about different ways. And other countries have figured out some things better than we have. And this aversion that we have of looking outside, our very narrow, look at the world, I think has hampered our progress in dealing with what change should look like and just focusing on the juvenile justice. So I think change is possible. I think that unfortunately, for people like Nishi and Clinton and I who are very impatient, it takes some time. But I think that in New York, I take great, pride. I don't know if pride is the right, but it warms my heart to know that every night there are less children, substantially less children, sleeping in a box, in a cage in New York. And so, that work has been very worthwhile. Do we need to do more? Absolutely.
Missy, you wanna add to this? Okay. So I'm gonna ask Terrence's question. He said, "What suggestions do the panelists have for leaders who want to shrink the control the state has over youth and carceral systems, and replace the state with a community control system to support youth?" Now defer to Missy.
Yeah, and I definitely want Gladys and Clinton to answer this question too. So, I think, so one of the things that Youth First, what we have facilitated and trained our partners in doing is visioning sessions with young people. And so these visioning sessions are conversations about how they would like to see the money that's currently spent on youth incarceration invested in their community. But then also when a young person comes in conflict with the law, like what could be different for them at the different points in the system, from arrest to detention to long-term incarceration. And so I think it's really important for system leaders to be holding visioning sessions with young people and actually take that input that they receive from young people, and also as we said, have sort of this joint power sharing model where it's like, okay, let's figure out how to make this happen together, and how do we make the money follow the young people rather than money following just being sucked into the system. And so, but yeah, I would love for Gladys and Clinton to answer Terrence's question, because Terrence can hear that from me all the time, but I'm sure they'd love to hear from you all. They would love to hear from you all.
I'll ask the
Clinton,
question.
you want to go? Yeah.
I'll ask the question again, just so you have. So, what are some suggestions that you have for leaders who want to shrink the control the state has over the youth and carceral system, and replace the state with community control system to support youth?
Please, Gladys, I'd love to.
No, I was short. You have to really have the ability to mobilize people. This is something that you don't do by yourself, but you provide leadership. You provide space for leaders to emerge. you need to be you need to be a champion, not the champion, but a champion, and create that awareness. And it's multi-tiered, right? You need to have a political strategy, right? You need to have a media strategy. It's a campaign, those campaigns that Youth First does really well, and really mobilizing what the public opinion, and mobilizing a diverse set of constituency that are joining and saying, no more. This has to change. We can do better. We have to do better. And there's lots of different messaging that needs to go out to be able to mobilize the kind of movement you need that really creates this transformational change that you want. And there are people that are doing that, and there are people that have done that. Clinton, what were you going to add?
I was just thinking about, all that you said, Gladys, that it takes, and I was even thinking back to our days at probation, and Mishi was there in a major part of what was taking place. And we were acting on many fronts, right? We were having conversations that had legislative implications, right? So we were coming up and actually, and Mishi was a major part of, and thought leader in this process of thinking about what kind of legislative agenda, what needed to be pushed to address the collateral consequences of being in the system, for one example, right? So there was that level, which required communications and education to try to push legislation to change, right? Systemic policy, what were the agency's policies that were within our power to change? And things like that, opening up NEONs, community centers,
yeah,
that provided opportunity for community participation and empowerment, right? Culture change, right, within your agency. And I think, all of the above that we've talked about, it really takes, because it's so many forces that maintain the status quo, right? So I think it's important just to think on many fronts strategically. So it wasn't just about, for us in probation, how to make a better probation department, right? But it was about these bigger questions that feed the whole monster, right? And so I think that's an important piece to it. So it's certainly complicated and huge, but we can identify the drivers. We can identify the targets, and I think, Gladys and Mishi and others have spoken to a lot of what those targets, many of those targets.
Clinton, you raised something really good, because, part of, I think, what we did was show alternative ways of doing it. And maybe there were interim steps, like the NEONs, right? I did Brooklyn for Brooklyn before, close to home, to show that we can bring young people back from upstate, facilities to their home borough. And we picked Brooklyn, right? And in the community, in a brownstone, right next, in a neighborhood, right? To show people that it was possible, and created a community advisory board attached to it, right? And had them come in, and it was an open door policy to show, look at these kids, look who they are. They are from your community, right? They are kids. So that people started to say, this is possible. These are not bad kids, right? And people wanted to become invested in them, and came in and did volunteer work and became mentors. And so that starts to change the mindset, right? And creates the sense that this is possible, like you did with the NEONs. There is a different way to provide services through a probation model, right? Mm-hmm. And that's but one iteration. You do that, and then you're able to do something even more out of the box, right? And you get there, and that's the way we did it. And I know that it really shows that it's possible to change, and maybe not, but over a couple of years. I mean, we were there for a couple of years, and we were able to accomplish what I consider to be substantial change. And we all acknowledge that more needs to be done, but there are ways of starting. This is hard, but it's doable. And at the end of the day, it's all about creating better solutions for young people. It's about young people and creating opportunities for young people. And so you need to try everything and anything that'll get you there.
No, thank you for all that. We're at time now, and I just want to conclude by saying that this webinar will be followed up with some resources, and also that the Justice Lab will be hosting continuing webinar series throughout next year as well. So this isn't a one-off type of thing. But I really want to thank all of the panelists for their contributions to today's conversation, really allowing me to sit in and really be a part of the learning journey for us in the audience. And I took a lot of notes, and I'm looking forward to following up with you all. But thank you.
Thank you.